A woman scarred by loss agrees to care for three brothers devastated by their mother's death. Instead of enforcing rules, she shares her own pain and wins the children's hearts. In the house where there was only chaos, she plants the first seeds of healing and true affection. Grand Avenue shimmered under the setting sun as Antonia Farrell observed the reflection of the orange sky in the windows of the skyscrapers. At 38, her face bore the marks of one who had known the bitter taste of early goodbyes. Her brown eyes, deep as wells of memories, examined the advertisement on her phone for the third time that afternoon. Nanny needed for 6-year-old triplets. Double salary. Proven experience. Residence in Beverly Hills, Los Angeles. The part that most caught her attention, however, was between the lines. Warning: the children have exhibited challenging behavior since their mother's passing. 17 professionals have quit in the last 6 months. Antonia took a deep breath. Unemployed for 2 months after the family she worked for moved abroad, she urgently needed a new position. The double salary meant she could continue helping her younger sister with her studies in Miami, and perhaps finally finish her own psychology course that she had interrupted years ago. Challenging behavior, she repeated to herself. She knew those words well. That's how adults described her when, at 9 years old, after losing her parents in an accident, she refused to follow rules in the temporary foster homes where she stayed. It wasn't rebellion, it was pain. Instead of sending a formal resume, Antonia wrote a heartfelt letter. I don't have impressive diplomas to present, but I carry with me the experience of someone who has been on the other side. I know how to recognize pain disguised as rebellion, because I was once a child labeled as difficult, when in truth I was just desperate for someone to understand my suffering. If your children are going through what I imagine, they don't need another person imposing rules. They need someone who knows how to listen to the silence between the screams. 2 days later, she was called for an interview at the imposing Maxwell mansion in Beverly Hills. The taxi passed through the gates of a property that looked straight out of an architecture magazine. Perfectly manicured gardens, a modern building with clean lines and large glass windows. However, as she was led inside by a tense-looking housekeeper, Antonia realized that the external perfection contrasted with the internal chaos. Richard Maxwell, one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the North American tech sector, received her in his office. Tall, with stubble and deep dark circles under his eyes, he looked older than his 42 years. The walls displayed awards and recognitions for his company, Maxwell Innovations, which had revolutionized the financial app market across North America. Ms. Farrell, he began. Without offering a handshake, I read your letter. It was different. His tone was a mix of skepticism and exhaustion. We've had candidates with master's degrees in pedagogy and specialization in child development. All of them quit. What makes you think you'll be different? Antonia held his gaze firmly. Because I'm not here to fix your children, Mr. Maxwell. No one is broken, just hurt. Richard seemed surprised by her frankness. He leaned back in his chair and for the first time truly observed her. Do you know why we're in this situation? I know the boy's mother is no longer present, she replied carefully, and that they are having difficulty coping with it. A heavy silence filled the room before Richard continued. Danielle, my wife, was in an accident 6 months ago. His voice faltered slightly. She was on her way to pick up a gift for our anniversary. The boys were with her, but stayed in the car with the driver while she went into the store. They saw everything through the window. He took a deep breath. Since then, Philip, Michael, and Arthur refuse to accept any female figure who tries to occupy her space. Not even my mother can get close to them. At that moment, a crash from upstairs interrupted the conversation. Richard closed his eyes as if gathering strength. It's bath time, he explained with a sigh. Usually that means a war with water, soap used to write on the walls, and at least one towel thrown out the window. Antonia couldn't suppress a small smile. May I meet them now? Richard hesitated, clearly worried about the first impression. Perhaps we should wait until tomorrow when, if I'm going to work with them, I need to see them as they are, not the rehearsed version. Surprised by her determination, Richard led her to the second floor. As they ascended, the sound of children's voices and thrown objects intensified. When he opened the door to the large bathroom, Antonia was met with a scene of absolute chaos. Three identical boys, with dark hair and intensely blue eyes like their fathers, had transformed the bathroom into an impromptu swimming pool. The marble walls were covered with drawings made of toothpaste. One of the sinks was overflowing while a towel blocked the drain, and what appeared to be a complete set of shampoos formed a foamy mountain in the middle of the floor. The temporary nanny, a middle-aged woman, was soaked and visibly on the verge of a nervous breakdown. "Mr. Maxwell, I tried, but they're impossible." Upon seeing their father, the three boys stopped momentarily. Their gazes alternated between Richard and the stranger beside him. "Who is she?" asked one of the triplets suspiciously. "Is she the new nanny?" questioned another, with a challenging glint in his eyes. "We don't want another replacement," shouted the third, throwing a wet sponge that passed inches from Antonia's face. "We want Mommy back." Richard seemed ready to explode into a reprimand, but Antonia lightly touched his arm, silently asking permission to intervene. Then, to everyone's astonishment, she knelt, took off her shoes, and calmly stepped into the flooded bathroom. "Actually," she said, rolling up her sleeves, "I'm not a replacement. No one can replace those we love." She sat on the edge of the bathtub, completely ignoring the water soaking her clothes. "My name is Antonia, and I also know what it's like when the world falls apart." The three boys stared at her, momentarily intrigued by her unexpected behavior. "Do you know how to make paper boats?" she asked, picking up a magazine that miraculously was still dry on a cabinet. "When I was a little older than you, I lost my parents. And on days when the rain wouldn't let me go out to play at the foster home, I would make paper boats and imagine they could take me far away." With skillful movements, she folded the page, creating a small boat. She placed it delicately in the water accumulated on the floor. "This will be our first secret," she continued, lowering her voice as if sharing a conspiracy. "Before we clean up all this mess, let's make a small fleet. What do you think?" One of the boys, whom Antonia would later discover was Michael, took a hesitant step toward her. "You lived in a foster home?" he asked, his eyes full of curiosity. Antonia nodded. "For 3 years, until my aunt could pick me up." "And you never saw your parents again?" asked another Arthur. "Not in this life," she replied gently, "but I found other people to love, and I discovered that our heart is like a house with many rooms. There's always room for someone else, without needing to remove who already lives there." The third boy, Philip, the most reserved of the three, remained at a safe distance, but his eyes no longer showed hostility, just a deep sadness that Antonia recognized immediately. "I know you don't know me," she continued, "but I promise to show you, even today, that it's possible to let someone care for you, even when your heart is in pieces." From the doorway, Richard watched the scene with an expression of astonishment. For the first time in 6 months, his children were not screaming or destroying something. They were listening. When the temporary nanny passed him, soaked and muttering her resignation, Richard barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the woman who, sitting on the wet floor of his luxurious bathroom, began to fold a second paper boat, patiently explaining each fold to 3 pairs of attentive eyes that, finally, seemed to have found an anchor in the storm that their lives had become. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you are watching us from. We continue. I promise this will be the best story you will ever hear. Antonia's first week at the Maxwell mansion unfolded like a delicate dance between advances and retreats. After that first encounter in the flooded bathroom, she officially began work the next day, settling into an elegant room on the staff floor. The mansion, though luxurious, carried an air of emotional abandonment. Photographs of Danielle had been removed from the walls, leaving lighter rectangular marks on the wallpaper. The curtains remained closed most of the time, as if the entire house was in mourning. Only in the triplets' room did their mother's portrait remain, a radiant smile frozen in time on the dresser they shared. On her third morning, while preparing breakfast for the boys, Antonia found Richard in the kitchen, a rare event according to Josephine, the family's trusted housekeeper. "Mr. Maxwell hardly ever appears before 8, Josephine commented in a low voice, adjusting her apron. "Since the accident, he only works. He leaves before the boys wake up and returns when they're already asleep. On weekends, he locks himself in his office." Richard, with a cup of coffee in his hands, seemed out of place in his own kitchen. He wore an impeccable suit, but his eyes revealed sleepless nights. "How are they reacting?" he asked without looking directly at Antonia. Better than I expected, she replied cautiously. Michael is the most receptive. Arthur observes everything before deciding to trust. Philip still keeps his distance, but he no longer screams when I try to help him with his uniform. Richard nodded, as if processing information from a business report. They have an appointment with the psychologist this afternoon. I know. It's on the schedule Miss Josephine gave me. Antonia hesitated, then decided to risk it. Do you usually accompany them? A tense silence settled before he responded. I have a meeting with investors today. Unfortunately, I won't be able to be present. I understand. Antonia maintained a neutral tone, although a spark of disapproval crossed her gaze. Perhaps at a future session. Perhaps, he replied vaguely, checking his wristwatch. I need to go. My driver is waiting. When Richard left, Josephine shook her head. He was different before, you know. Always present, played with the boys. Danielle and he were an enviable couple. Since the incident, it's as if something died inside him too. Antonia reflected on these words as she climbed the stairs to wake the triplets. Opening the bedroom door, she found a surprise. All three were already awake, sitting in a circle on the rug, flipping through a photo album. Good morning, she said softly, so as not to startle them. The three looked up simultaneously. Michael, the most communicative, was the first to respond. We're showing Mommy to you, he explained, pointing to the album. So you know what she was like. Antonia sat on the floor with them, maintaining a respectful distance. May I see? Arthur slid the album toward her. The pages revealed a woman of serene beauty, wavy brown hair, and the same hypnotic blue eyes as the boys. In almost every photo, Danielle smiled, surrounded by her children or beside Richard. She made the best chocolate chip cookies in the world, Arthur commented, pointing to a photo where the four were in the kitchen, faces smeared with chocolate. And she told stories using different voices for each character, Michael added. Philip, who until then had been observing in silence, touched a photograph where Danielle appeared playing the guitar in a garden. She used to sing us to sleep. Now no one sings. Antonia's heart ached. You miss her very much, don't you? The three nodded in unison. You know, she began, choosing her words carefully, when I lost my parents, what helped me most was being able to talk about them, to tell stories about the happy times we had together. But Daddy doesn't like it when we talk about Mommy, Michael said, lowering his voice. His eyes get watery and he leaves the room. It's difficult for him too, Antonia explained. Sometimes adults don't know how to deal with sadness and end up hiding from it. How do you hide from sadness? Arthur asked, genuinely curious. Antonia smiled gently. Some hide in work, like your father. Others get angry at the world. When I was a child, I hid by breaking rules, like you've been doing. Philip's eyes widened, surprised by her perceptive observation. But, she continued, I discovered there's a better way to deal with sadness. We can transform it into something beautiful, as a way to honor those we love. How? Philip asked, speaking directly to her for the first time. How about we start today? After school, we can make chocolate chip cookies using your mother's recipe. And who knows, maybe you can teach me one of the songs she used to sing. The three boys' eyes sparkled with a mixture of excitement and hope. At that moment, Antonia knew she had found the way to their hearts. The routine began to establish itself in the following weeks. Antonia discovered that despite their challenging behavior, the triplets were intelligent and sensitive children. Michael, the natural leader, possessed an insatiable curiosity about how things worked. Arthur, the most sociable, collected stories and loved to recount them with elaborate details. Philip, the most introspective, revealed himself to be a talented artist, filling notebooks with detailed illustrations that expressed what he couldn't say with words. Gradually, small changes were noticed by the household staff. The triplets began to respect schedules, cooperate with simple tasks and, more surprisingly, to smile occasionally. The room, once a battlefield, now displayed colorful drawings on the walls and organized books on the shelves. One Friday afternoon, after the boys' swimming lesson at the club, Antonia drove them back home in the family's chauffeured car. When they arrived, they found Richard unexpectedly at home, talking to a man in a suit in the entrance hall. "Daddy!" the triplets exclaimed in unison, running toward him. Richard seemed momentarily disconcerted by the display of affection, but knelt to hug them. "Hello, boys. How was your swimming lesson? First, the instructor said I'm ready for the deep end, Michael announced proudly, and I managed to hold my breath for almost a minute. Arthur added. I drew you swimming with us, Philip said, holding out a folded paper he pulled from his pocket. Richard examined the drawing with an expression that mixed surprise and contained emotion. It's very beautiful, Philip. Thank you. The man next to Richard observed the scene with interest. Antonia noticed he was holding a document folder and had a worried expression. Children, Richard said, why don't you go take a bath and change while I talk to Dr. Marcus? Afterward, we can have dinner together. The boys looked at Antonia, who nodded encouragingly. Let's go. Whoever gets to the bathroom first chooses tonight's movie. As the three animatedly climbed the stairs, Antonia noticed the visitor's evaluating gaze on her. You must be the new nanny, he said, extending his hand. Marcus Stone, family lawyer. Antonia Farrell. She replied, shaking his hand. Antonia has done a remarkable job with the boys, Richard commented, with a tone that revealed both gratitude and surprise. I'm glad to hear that, Marcus said, exchanging a meaningful look with Richard, especially considering the circumstances. What circumstances? Antonia asked, sensing there was something important not being said. Richard hesitated, running a hand through his hair in a nervous gesture she had never seen before. Antonia, Dr. Stone came to warn me about something we need to discuss, he began, signaling for them to enter the office. Once inside, with the door closed, Richard seemed a different man, not the powerful businessman, but a vulnerable and worried father. Channel Insight is preparing a report about our family, Marcus explained, placing some documents on the table. Apparently, a former employee sold information about the boy's behavior after Danielle's accident. What kind of information? Antonia asked, feeling a chill run down her spine. The worst kind, Richard sighed. Stories about the 17 nannies who couldn't handle it, about problems at school, about my absence. They're building a narrative that the boys are uncontrollable and I'm a negligent father. That's absurd, Antonia protested. The children were suffering. They needed help, not judgment. Unfortunately, Marcus continued, Channel Insight is known for its sensationalist journalism. The anchor, Susan Palmer, has already announced on social media that she will reveal the dark side of one of Los Angeles's most powerful families. And what does that mean for us? Antonia questioned, noticing how she naturally included herself in the family equation. Richard stood up, walking to the window. For a moment he observed the gardens where, in happier times, he played with his children. It means our privacy will be invaded. That the boys, who were finally starting to recover, will be publicly exposed as problematic. He turned to face her. And you, Antonia, will probably be the next target. They'll investigate your past, question your qualifications. I'm concerned, Marcus interjected, that this might lead you to reconsider your position here. We would perfectly understand if I wanted to leave to protect my reputation, Antonia completed, with a firm tone that surprised both men. You don't know me very well, then. She approached Richard, holding his gaze. Do you believe your children are uncontrollable monsters? Of course not, he replied, offended by the question. Then why should we fear the judgment of people who don't even know them? Antonia crossed her arms. The boys are hurt children, not broken. And they're getting better every day. A thoughtful silence filled the room before she continued. When does the report air? Sunday night, Marcus replied. During prime time. Antonia nodded, pensive. Then I suggest we do something that hasn't happened in this house for a long time. What? Richard asked, genuinely curious. Let's watch TV together as a family. All 5 of us. And when this Susan Palmer says what she thinks she knows about us, we'll be united to face her. Richard's expression slowly transformed. For the first time since Antonia arrived at the mansion, a genuine smile illuminated his tired face. You said us, he observed. I did, Antonia confirmed, with determination, because while I'm here, I'm part of this family. And no one hurts my family without resistance. Sunday arrived with a palpable tension at the Maxwell mansion. Antonia had explained to the boys, in simple and sincere words, that some people on television might say unpleasant things about the family, but that this did not define who they were. It's like when someone at school says they don't like your drawing, she explained, as she helped Philip organize his colored pencils. That person's opinion doesn't change the value of what you created. The triplets, though not fully understanding the extent of the situation, perceived that something important was happening. Throughout the day, they were unusually quiet and cooperative, as if they felt their behavior could, in some way, influence what would be said about them on television. To make the evening less tense, Antonia proposed a special dinner. "Let's make homemade pizza," she suggested. "Each of you can choose your own toppings." The idea was met with enthusiasm. Soon the kitchen transformed into a small pizza factory, with flour spread across the counters and laughter echoing through the walls. Richard, who rarely participated in domestic activities, appeared at the door and watched the scene for a few minutes. "Can I help?" he finally asked, with a shyness that seemed out of place in such a powerful man. The boys froze, looking from their father to Antonia, as if waiting for guidance on how to react to this unprecedented behavior. "Of course, you can," Antonia replied naturally. "We were just needing another hand to stretch the dough." Richard removed his jacket, rolled up the sleeves of his dress shirt, and, with awkward movements, began to work the dough. Michael approached to supervise his father's work, while Arthur animatedly narrated the story of how his gym teacher had slipped in a puddle in the schoolyard. Philip, the most reserved, kept his distance, but his eyes never left his father, as if studying a rare phenomenon. "Have you made pizza before, Daddy?" he finally asked. Richard stopped, his hands covered in flour, and looked at his son. A slight blush tinged his cheeks. "To tell you the truth, the last time was with your mother, when we were dating. We lived in a small apartment near UCLA and didn't have money for delivery." The three boys' eyes widened, fascinated by this revelation of a past where the powerful Richard Maxwell couldn't afford to order food. "Mommy knew how to make pizza?" Arthur asked, always eager for new stories about his mother. A nostalgic smile illuminated Richard's face. "Actually, no. Our first attempt was a disaster. The dough was as hard as cardboard." He chuckled softly at the memory. "But then we got better." "Your mother always said the secret was to knead the dough with love." Antonia observed the interaction with a warm heart. It was the first time she had seen Richard talk about Danielle with his children without his eyes filling with tears or him quickly changing the subject. Dinner proceeded in an atmosphere of familiarity that the house had not experienced for months. Sitting at the large dining room table, with the homemade pizzas in the center, the five talked, laughed, and, for a few hours, forgot the shadow that hung over them. When the clock struck 8:45, however, reality reasserted itself. Channel Insight's program would begin in 15 minutes. Richard suggested that the boys could go to bed, but Antonia gently intervened. "I think it's important for them to see it. This is their family, Richard. They deserve to know what's being said and understand that not everything on TV is true." Reluctantly, he agreed. Everyone gathered in the living room, where the enormous flat-screen television usually remained off. The triplets huddled together on the sofa, with Antonia beside them. Richard remained standing, tense as a violin string about to snap. The minutes of waiting seemed to drag on. Finally, Channel Insight's sensationalist jingle filled the room, followed by the made-up face and grave expression of Susan Palmer. "Good evening, America." Tonight, on Channel Insight, we reveal the dark side of one of the country's most influential families. Abandonment, troubled children, and a fortune that cannot buy peace. The hidden tragedy behind the gates of the Maxwell mansion. The report began with aerial images of the property, followed by photos of Richard at corporate events. The narrator described the tech empire built by the entrepreneur, his marriage to the beautiful psychologist Danielle Albright, and the birth of the triplets, described as the fairy tale of the LA elite. Then, the tone changed drastically. "But the fairy tale turned into a nightmare when Danielle suffered a tragic accident 6 months ago," Susan continued. "Sources close to the family reveal that, since then, the Maxwell mansion has become a battlefield. The triplets, witnesses to the accident, developed violent and destructive behaviors. The screen showed blurred images supposedly representing the boys in crisis situations, although it was impossible to confirm if they were actually them. A succession of interviews with former employees, or with blurred faces and distorted voices, reported episodes of terror in the mansion. They broke everything, screamed all day long, said a female voice. No nanny lasted more than a few weeks. The father was never present, added another anonymous source. He left everything in the hands of employees while drowning himself in work. Richard clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles were white. Antonia watched the boys' faces, which shifted from confusion to sadness as they understood that they were the monsters described in the report. The last straw came when the journalist directly questioned Richard's ability as a father. Exclusive sources revealed that the entrepreneur reportedly said he doesn't know how to handle his children, and that they will never be normal again. Experts consulted by our report question whether the children would not be better off under professional care, away from paternal neglect. That's a lie, Michael shouted, jumping off the sofa. Daddy never said that. Arthur began to cry silently, while Philip buried his face in his hands, as if he wanted to disappear. Turn off that garbage, Richard ordered, his voice trembling with fury. Antonia picked up the remote control and silenced the TV, but did not turn it off completely. Instead, she turned to the boys. You know none of that is true, right? She asked, holding Michael's hands, who was shaking with indignation. But they said we're monsters, Arthur sobbed, that no one can stay with us. And that Daddy doesn't want us, Philip added, in a voice so low it was almost unheard. Richard finally came out of his state of shock and knelt before his children, his eyes watery. None of that is true, my sons. I love you more than anything in the world. Then why are you never here? Michael challenged with surprising courage. Why are you always working? The question hit Richard like a physical blow. He lowered his head, momentarily speechless. Antonia watched the scene with a heavy heart. It was the moment of truth, the instant when the wall Richard had built around his emotions could finally begin to crumble. I think your father is afraid, she said softly. Richard looked up, surprised by the intervention. Afraid, Arthur repeated, confused. But Daddy isn't afraid of anything. He's everyone's boss. We all have fears, Antonia explained. Sometimes when we lose someone we love very much, we become afraid to love again, because we don't want to feel that pain again. A deep silence descended upon the room as the children processed that new perspective. Is it true, Daddy? Philip asked, finally looking directly at his father. Are you afraid? Richard swallowed hard, visibly fighting years of conditioning to hide his emotions. Yes, he finally admitted, his voice hoarse. I'm afraid of failing you, of not being the father you deserve. You hide in work, Michael concluded, with the clarity that sometimes only children possess, like when I hide under the covers during a storm. Richard nodded, unable to speak. A single tear rolled down his face, the first his children had seen him shed since the accident. Antonia felt she needed to give them a private moment. She discreetly stood up to leave the room, but was stopped by Arthur's voice. Antonia, are you going to leave us too? She turned back, finding 3 pairs of blue eyes fixed on her, full of apprehension. Why would I do that? She asked gently. The woman on TV said no one can stand being with us, Arthur explained. The other nannies left. Antonia returned to the sofa, sitting between them. I'll tell you a secret. Do you know what I saw when I met you in that flooded bathroom? I didn't see monsters or problematic children. I saw 3 brave boys trying to deal with a pain too big for their small hearts. She looked at each of them before continuing. You're not broken. You're hurt. And wounds need time and care to heal. Philip, who rarely initiated physical contact, rested his head on her shoulder. How did you heal your wounds, Antonia? After your parents were gone. She took a deep breath, aware that Richard was also listening intently. I never completely healed. In fact, I don't think grief is something to be healed. It's something to be lived, integrated into our story. For a long time, I thought I needed to get over it and move on. But I learned that we can carry love and longing together, that pain can transform into a way to honor those we've lost. The words hung in the air, full of truth and comfort. Richard, still kneeling before them, seemed to be listening not only with his ears but with every cell of his being. What do we do now? He asked, looking at Antonia as if she were a beacon in the darkness. She smiled softly. Now we show that journalist and the whole world that they are wrong, not with words or interviews but with actions, by being the family we truly are, not the one they imagine. That night, when the boys finally went to sleep, it wasn't in their separate beds. but together in the master bedroom, nestled beside their father. Richard promised he would take the next morning off to take them to school personally. Antonia, watching from the doorway, felt a strange mixture of joy and apprehension. She had helped start a healing process, but knew the road would be long, and more disturbing still, she realized that her own heart was beginning to get involved in ways she hadn't planned. As she walked to her room, her phone vibrated with a message from Dr. Marcus. "Just watched the program. Unfortunately, this is just the beginning. The social worker from Child Protective Services contacted me. They want to schedule a visit to assess the family environment." The report had an effect. Antonia sat on the edge of the bed, the weight of reality settling in. The media storm had only just begun, and the shockwaves threatened to tear from the ground the fragile roots this family was trying to replant. With determination, she replied, "Tell them they are welcome. We have nothing to hide." The week following the broadcast of the report was a whirlwind for the Maxwell family. The mansion's phone rang incessantly with calls from journalists eager for statements. Paparazzi took turns outside the gates, hoping to capture any image that could fuel the scandal. The boys' school called, concerned about the possible impact of the exposure on the educational environment. Richard, surprisingly, cancelled all Monday meetings to deal with the situation personally, a decision that left his executives in shock. For the first time in months, he was present at breakfast, helping his children get ready for school. "I don't want you to worry about what other children might say," he explained, adjusting Michael's uniform tie. "If anyone is unkind, talk to your teacher or call me immediately." The triplets, still processing the events of the previous night, showed a mixture of apprehension and determination. Philip, the most sensitive to changes in atmosphere, seemed especially nervous. "What if nobody wants to play with us?" he asked, his voice trembling. Antonia, who was organizing lunchboxes in the kitchen, approached with a suggestion. "How about we bring those cookies we made yesterday? Sharing something delicious is a great way to make friends." The idea lit up the boys' faces, and soon they were packing the cookies into small decorated bags. When the driver arrived to take them, Richard surprised everyone once again. "Today I'll take you," he announced, grabbing the keys to one of his sports cars. Antonia watched from the window as the four got into the vehicle, feeling a wave of pride at the small but significant change in Richard's behavior. "Small steps," she murmured to herself. Taking advantage of the time alone, Antonia began to prepare the house for the social worker's visit, which was scheduled for the next day. It wasn't about creating a facade. She knew experienced professionals saw through that, but about ensuring that the true essence of that home could shine without distractions. With Josephine's help, she organized an album with Philip's recent drawings, including those depicting happy moments with Antonia and his father. She gathered Arthur's school essays, several of them praised by the teacher for their creativity. She separated photos of Michael's progress in swimming lessons, showing how his confidence had grown in recent weeks. As she worked, Josephine shared her concern. "I've been through a visit like this before, when I worked for another family. They observe everything. What's in the fridge, how the children interact, if there's a routine." "We're not hiding anything, Josephine," Antonia reassured. "The boys are making progress. Richard is finally present. We have an imperfect family, like all of them, but one that is fighting to heal its wounds." The phone rang, interrupting their conversation. It was Dr. Marcus with news that made Antonia's heart race. "The social worker moved up the visit to this afternoon," he informed her. "It seems they received more anonymous complaints after the report. I'm on my way to offer legal support." Antonia felt a chill down her spine. "Today?" But Richard took the boys to school and planned to pick them up. He already knows. He's heading home now. When she hung up, Antonia noticed her hands trembling slightly. Not from fear of scrutiny, she had nothing to hide, but from the sudden realization of how important this family had become to her. The idea that someone could separate the boys from Richard, however flawed he had been in recent months, was unbearable. 2 hours later, the doorbell rang. Through the security system, Antonia saw a middle-aged woman, with grey hair pulled back in an austere bun and a serious expression. Beside her, a younger man carried a folder and a tablet. "Dr. Rebecca Carter from Child Protective Services," the woman announced when Antonia opened the door. "This is my assistant, Luke Oliver. Welcome, Antonia replied, keeping her voice calm despite her nervousness. I'm Antonia Farrell, the triplets' nanny. Mr. Maxwell is on his way. He had to pick up the children from school. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. He picks up the children personally? According to our information, he rarely participates in his children's daily lives. Things have changed in recent weeks, Antonia explained, leading them to the living room. Would you like something to drink while we wait? The visit began with a thorough inspection of the house. Rebecca walked through the rooms making notes, while Luke discreetly photographed details that caught his attention. Antonia accompanied them, answering questions about the children's routine diet and activities. In the boys' room, Rebecca examined the drawings on the wall. Who is this person who appears in almost all the recent drawings? She asked, pointing to a female figure with dark hair. That's me, Antonia replied. Philip expresses his feelings better through drawings. Initially, he only drew sad scenes, but gradually he began to include happy moments. Rebecca nodded without revealing what she was thinking. Upon reaching Richard's office, she paused before a recent photograph on the desk. The smiling triplets at a picnic in the garden, with Richard and Antonia in the background. When was this photo taken? Last Sunday. It was the first time Richard participated in an outdoor activity with the boys since... Antonia hesitated. Since their mother's accident, Rebecca completed, in a neutral tone. You know, Ms. Farrell, I've seen many situations like this. Wealthy families who believe that money and competent staff are enough to raise emotionally healthy children. Before Antonia could respond, they heard animated voices coming from the entrance. The triplets had arrived with Richard. What followed surprised even Antonia. Instead of being intimidated by the presence of strangers, the boys entered like a small hurricane of energy. Antonia! Daddy let us buy ingredients, Michael exclaimed, displaying a grocery bag. We're going to make cookies for Daddy's company workers, Arthur explained. It was my idea. Philip, the shyest, silently approached Antonia and handed her a drawing he had made at school. She unfolded it to find a colorful representation of 5 people holding hands. The 3 boys, Richard and herself, and under a large smiling sun. It's our family, he murmured, just loud enough for Antonia to hear. Richard, who had clearly been informed about the surprise visit, maintained his composure. Dr. Carter, Mr. Oliver, welcome. I see you've already met Antonia. Rebecca observed the interaction between the children and the nanny with professional interest. Your children seem quite attached to Miss Farrell. And with good reason, Richard replied. She brought light back into this house when we needed it most. In the following minutes, an unexpected phenomenon occurred. Instead of trying to impress the visitors with exemplary behavior, the boys simply continued to be themselves, talking about school, showing their favorite toys, occasionally arguing among themselves as any siblings would. Richard took advantage of a moment when the children were distracted to speak privately with Rebecca. I know the report painted a terrible picture, he said, and I won't lie by saying it was all made up. The boys went through difficult months after losing their mother, and I didn't know how to help them. Did you seek psychological help for them? Rebecca asked. Yes, from the beginning. They attend therapy twice a week. I also started recently. This last detail clearly surprised Antonia, who didn't know Richard had finally agreed to seek help for himself. The visit took an unexpected turn when Luke suggested an activity. I'd like to talk to you boys a bit. How about we draw together? Sitting at the dining room table, the triplets concentrated on the papers and colorful markers Luke provided. He asked them to draw specific things. Your family, a happy day, something that makes you sad, while casually chatting about school and friends. Philip, surprisingly, was the most communicative during this exercise. This is Daddy working, he explained, showing a drawing of a man behind a desk. He does important things on the computer. And does that make you sad? Luke asked gently. Philip shook his head. It used to, because he never had time for us. But now he works less. Yesterday he taught me how to ride my bike without training wheels. Arthur, who was drawing what appeared to be a graveyard, spoke without lifting his eyes from the paper. I miss Mommy. She's not coming back, but Antonia said we can keep her inside here. He pointed to his own chest. And that it's okay to be sad sometimes. Michael, always the leader, showed his drawing with pride. This is our family now. Mommy is in heaven, but she's still part of our family. And Antonia is here with us. We're different, but we're still a family. Across the room, Rebecca watched as Luke conducted the activity. Her expression remained professional, but something in her eyes had softened. When it was snack time, the children insisted on preparing the cookies they had planned. Under Antonia's supervision, they measured ingredients, mixed the dough, and formed small discs that went into the oven. Throughout the process, they talked naturally about school, friends, and plans for the weekend. At the end of the afternoon, after observing the family for hours, including bath time and dinner, Rebecca called Richard and Antonia for a private conversation in the office. "Mr. Maxwell, Ms. Farrell," she began, with the same serious expression as when she arrived. "I rarely see a family working so actively to heal deep emotional wounds." Both held their breath, surprised by the unexpectedly positive tone. The children are clearly progressing. They talk openly about their feelings, have an established routine, and most importantly, feel safe to express both joy and sadness. This is fundamental for a healthy grieving process. Richard exhaled, visibly relieved. "However," Rebecca continued, "there is still much work to be done. The boys need consistency, Mr. Maxwell. The presence you demonstrated today and in recent days needs to become permanent." "You have my commitment," Richard replied firmly. Rebecca then turned to Antonia. "As for you, it is evident the bond you have formed with the children. My recommendation is that this bond be preserved and strengthened." She closed her folder, preparing to conclude the visit. "My report will indicate that despite the challenges, this is a family functioning adequately within the circumstances. I will recommend monthly follow-ups for another 6 months, just to ensure that the progress continues." At the moment of farewell, something unexpected happened. Philip, the most withdrawn of the triplets, approached Rebecca and handed her a cookie wrapped in a napkin. "It's for you," he said simply, "because you take care of children who need help, like Antonia takes care of us." The social worker's eyes, normally so analytical, softened completely. She knelt to get to the boy's level. "Thank you, Philip. This is the most special gift I've received this week." When the Child Protective Services car finally left the property, Richard, Antonia, and the boys remained for a moment at the entrance of the house, as if collectively processing what had happened. "Did we do it?" Michael asked, always direct. Richard knelt, hugging all 3 children at once. "Yes, champ, you were incredible today. You showed them who you really are, special boys with huge hearts." Later, after the children had gone to sleep, Richard found Antonia in the garden, contemplating the stars. For the first time since she had arrived in that house, he seemed truly at peace. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For believing in us when I didn't even believe." "For seeing beyond the chaos and the pain." Antonia smiled, feeling a strange mixture of professional accomplishment and something more, something personal she dared not name. "This is just the beginning," she replied. "We still have a long way to go." What neither of them said, but both felt, was that they now wished to travel that path together. Not just as employer and employee, but as 2 people who, through adversity, had discovered an unexpected connection. In the boys' room, 3 pairs of blue eyes finally closed in peaceful sleep, without nightmares for the first time in months. In their dreams, a new version of family began to take shape, different from the one they knew before, but equally precious. The following months brought subtle, yet profound, changes to the Maxwell mansion, where silence punctuated by bursts of childish crying once reigned, now echoed laughter, conversations, and occasionally even music. The curtains remained open during the day, allowing natural light to flood the rooms. Photos of Danielle, carefully selected by Richard and the boys, once again adorned the walls, no longer hidden as a painful secret, but celebrated as a vital part of the family history. The impact of the Child Protective Services visit reverberated in unexpected ways. The threat of losing his children had awakened something in Richard that no therapy had been able to achieve. The visceral understanding that nothing, not his billionaire company, nor his reputation, nor his grief, was more important than those 3 small lives that depended on him. One Wednesday afternoon, 4 months after Antonia's arrival, Richard's office in the mansion witnessed an unprecedented scene. The entrepreneur, known for his relentless dedication to work, ended a video conference with foreign investors 30 minutes earlier than planned. "Gentlemen, we'll have to continue tomorrow," he announced, to the astonishment of executives from 3 different continents. "I promised my children I would attend their school presentation today, and it's a commitment I cannot postpone." When he hung up the call, he found Josephine standing at the door, holding his folder with important documents. "You need to sign these contracts before you leave," she said, with the formal tone she had always used. "You can leave them on my desk, Josephine. I'll sign them when I get back." The housekeeper hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Dr. Stone said they are urgent. The startup acquisition." "That can also wait," Richard interrupted with surprising serenity. "I've learned that urgent has different meanings depending on the context. Nothing is more urgent than being present for my children today." Josephine smiled, a rare gesture that completely transformed her austere face. "Ms. Danielle would be very proud," she commented, before discreetly withdrawing. At the theater of the prestigious Beverly Hills private school, Richard found Antonia already seated in the second row, saving a place for him. When their gazes met, a smile of approval lit up her face. "I thought you might be late," Antonia commented as he settled beside her. "I promised I'd be here," he replied simply. The presentation was a reimagining of The Little Prince, her adapted to include contemporary environmental themes. Michael played the protagonist, with his natural leadership ability. Arthur, with his narrative talent, played the storyteller who guided the audience through the adventures. Philip, who preferred to stay out of the spotlight, had surprised everyone by accepting the role of the pilot, small in lines, but crucial to the story. When the triplets took the stage, Richard felt an emotion he hadn't experienced in a long time, pure pride, without the shadow of guilt that usually accompanied any positive feeling since Danielle's accident. "They're incredible," he whispered to Antonia. "Yes," she agreed. "They rehearsed so much." Philip completely overcame his stage fright. During the presentation, Richard observed not only his children but also the woman beside him. Antonia watched with as much enthusiasm and pride as any mother in the audience. She knew every line, every cue, probably having helped with rehearsals countless times. Something stirred in Richard's chest. A warm, comforting feeling he had forgotten was possible to feel. It wasn't just gratitude for everything Antonia had done for his family. It was something deeper and more frightening. At the end of the show, to enthusiastic applause, the 3 boys ran directly to where Richard and Antonia were sitting, ignoring the protocol of remaining on stage for the final bows. "Did you see? I didn't forget any lines," Michael exclaimed, his eyes shining with excitement. "And I spoke really loud, like the teacher asked," Arthur added. Philip, still dressed as the pilot, simply smiled, his face flushed with satisfaction. "You were spectacular," Richard said, kneeling to hug them. "I'm so proud I can barely explain it." A teacher approached, initially with an expression of reprimand for having left the stage, but her demeanor softened upon witnessing the family moment. "Mr. Maxwell, Ms. Farrell, the boys are unrecognizable since the beginning of the semester," she commented. "Especially Philip. His participation in class has increased significantly." "The credit is all Antonia's," Richard replied, casting a look of sincere admiration at the nanny. Antonia blushed slightly. "It's a team effort. The boys are extraordinary, and Richard has been a much more present father." The teacher smiled as if confirming a suspicion. "Well, whatever you're doing, it's working wonderfully. By the way, Mr. Maxwell, the administration would like to invite you to join the Parent Council. We believe your business experience could contribute to our educational projects." Richard seemed momentarily surprised by the invitation, a clear contrast to the image of an absent father that the school probably had of him until a few months ago. "It would be an honor," he replied. "In fact, I have some ideas about how to integrate technology and emotional education that I'd like to share." On the way back home, the car was filled with lively conversation about the presentation. The boys recounted every detail, from backstage nerves to the small improvisations they made when a classmate forgot their lines. When they arrived at the mansion, Josephine awaited them with a surprise. She had prepared a small feast to celebrate the success of the presentation, including each of the triplets' favorite dishes. "The dining room is ready for the artists," she announced with a fond formality. Dinner proceeded in a celebratory atmosphere. The boys, still energized by their success, talked all at once. Richard, instead of calling for order as he would have in the past, simply smiled, occasionally asking questions that further stimulated their enthusiasm. Antonia observed the scene with a mix of happiness and a pang of melancholy she couldn't quite explain. Seeing that family finally finding its way back to joy, she felt simultaneously fulfilled and in some way displaced, as if she were watching something beautiful through a window that didn't entirely belong to her. After dinner, while helping the boys with their bath and bedtime routine, Antonia felt a growing certainty. Soon her work there would be complete. The family she had found devastated by grief and emotional detachment was healing. Richard had finally embraced his role as a present father. The boys had learned to process their feelings in a healthy way. Her mission, which was never to replace the mother they had lost, but to help them find a new balance, was almost accomplished. This thought caused an unexpected ache in her chest. In just over 4 months, those children had become part of her life in a way no previous job had allowed. And Richard, well, it was better not to explore the nature of the confused feelings she was beginning to harbor for him. When she put the boys to bed, Michael asked a question that caught her off guard. "Antonia, do you like our dad?" She felt her face flush. "Of course I do. Your dad is a good man who loves you very much." "No, I mean, do you like him like in stories? Like the princess likes the prince?" Arthur and Philip immediately became interested in the conversation, sitting up in their beds. "I saw you looking at him today," Michael insisted, with the perceptiveness of one who observes more than adults imagine. "The same way Aunt Mary looks at Uncle Peter. And Daddy looks at you differently too," Arthur added. "He smiles more when you're around." Antonia took a deep breath, searching for an appropriate answer for 6-year-olds without completely lying. "Your father and I get along very well, and I have enormous affection for the whole family. But adults have complicated relationships, different from stories of princes and princesses." "Why?" Philip questioned, genuinely curious. Because real life has more layers. I work for your father, I take care of you. That creates a different kind of relationship. But you could not work for him and still take care of us, Michael argued, with impeccable logic. You could live here because you want to, not because you're paid. Antonia felt cornered by the innocent, childish insight. "Time for bed, little philosophers," she said affectionately, deflecting the subject. "Tomorrow is a school day, and famous artists like you need to rest." After turning off the lights and leaving only the nightlight on, Antonia headed to her own room. In the hallway, she found Richard coming out of his office. "Are they asleep yet?" he asked. "Almost. They're very excited about the success of the play." Richard smiled, a gesture that had become more frequent in recent weeks. "They were truly extraordinary today. Thank you for insisting that I not miss the presentation." "You would have gone anyway," Antonia replied. "You're different now, Richard. More connected." A brief silence settled between them, not uncomfortable but charged with something unsaid. "Antonia, I'd like to talk to you about something important," Richard finally said, "but not here in the hallway. Perhaps tomorrow after the boys go to school." She nodded, feeling an inexplicable apprehension. "Of course. Is everything all right?" "Yes," he assured with an enigmatic smile. "In fact, I think everything is better than it has been in a long time." That night, Antonia took a long time to fall asleep. Her mind buzzed with possibilities. Perhaps Richard wanted to discuss a change in her duties now that the boys were more stable. Or perhaps, no, it was better not to feed hopes based on childish interpretations of looks and smiles. The next morning, after taking the boys to school, Antonia found Richard on the back porch, contemplating the garden that had been Danielle's favorite space. He held 2 cups of coffee, extending one to her when she approached. "Thank you," she said, sitting in the chair beside him. For a few moments both remained silent, observing the well-maintained garden where butterflies danced among the newly bloomed spring flowers. "This was her favorite place," Richard commented softly. "Danielle spent hours here with the boys, teaching them the names of plants, telling stories about the butterflies." Antonia nodded, respecting the memory. "For a long time," he continued, "I couldn't even look at this garden. It was as if every flower, every bench, every pathstone screamed her absence." He paused, sipping his coffee. But now when I look at this place, I still feel Danielle's presence, but in a different way. Not as an accusation or a reminder of what I lost, but as a precious part of our history. That's how it should be, Antonia replied softly. Our losses don't disappear, but the pain transforms with time. Richard turned to her, his intense blue eyes fixed on hers. You transformed this house, Antonia. Not just for the boys, but for me too. When you arrived, I was simply existing, not living. You were suffering, she said gently, and trying to protect yourself from the pain in the only way you knew how. Yes, but you showed us another way. You taught us that we can honor those we've lost without ceasing to embrace the present. He paused, as if gathering courage. The boys love you, you know. Antonia smiled, feeling a pang in her heart. I love them too. They are extraordinary children. And what about me? Richard asked, with a vulnerability he had never shown before. What do you feel for me, Antonia? The question hung in the air between them, charged with possibilities and unspoken fears. Antonia felt her heart race, torn between the honesty she had always valued and the fear of complicating an already delicate situation. Richard, She hesitated, searching for the right words. I deeply admire the journey you've made in these months. The father you've become, the strength you've shown to face your grief and rebuild your connection with the boys. But that's not what I asked, he insisted softly. Without pressure, just with genuine interest. Antonia took a deep breath, realizing she had reached a point of no return. I have developed feelings for you that go beyond professional, yes. But I have always kept the limits of my role here clear. Richard nodded as if confirming something he already suspected. The boys noticed before I did. Last night as I tucked them in, something I learned from you, by the way. Michael asked me why I wasn't asking you to be my girlfriend. Antonia couldn't help but smile. He asked me a similar question yesterday. And what did you say? That adults have complicated relationships, she admitted. That I work for you, I take care of them, and that creates a different kind of relationship. Richard placed his cup on the side table and gently took Antonia's hands in his. What if you no longer worked for me? If you could stay not as an employee but as... The sound of the phone interrupted the moment. Richard closed his eyes briefly, clearly frustrated by the interruption. I have to take this. It's Dr. Stone's number. As he moved away to answer the call, Antonia remained seated, her heart beating fast, her mind trying to process what had almost been said. Was Richard really suggesting? From the other side of the porch, she watched as he spoke on the phone, his expression shifting from irritation to surprise, and then to something close to astonishment. That's unbelievable, she heard him say. Yes, of course she needs to know. We're talking right now, I'll tell her. When he hung up, Richard returned with a strange glint in his eye, a mixture of admiration and something that seemed almost reverence. What happened? Antonia asked, feeling a growing apprehension. Richard sat down beside her again, too agitated to stay still. That Channel Insight report, which tried to destroy us, ended up having a completely unexpected effect. What do you mean? After the Child Protective Services visit, Rebecca Carter decided to do something extraordinary. She wrote an article for the Family Gazette about how sensationalist media can harm families in the process of grieving and recovery. Without using our names, of course, but describing how she found perfectly adjusted and loving children, despite what had been reported. That's wonderful, Antonia commented, still not understanding why the phone call had caused such an impact on Richard. Yes, but that's not all. The article went viral. Psychologists, family therapists, and experts in child grief began to share it, discussing how the case demonstrated the importance of empathetic approaches for traumatized children. He paused, his eyes shining with admiration. Guess who became the center of the discussions? Rebecca? No, you, Antonia. Rebecca described in detail your approach with the boys, without using names, but explaining how a nanny with personal experience of loss transformed 3 problematic children into emotionally healthy boys, teaching them to honor their mother's memory instead of fearing the pain. Antonia felt her face flush. But I only did what I thought was right. I didn't follow any specific methodology. Exactly why it's so powerful, Richard continued, increasingly animated. Dr. Stone says that television programs, universities, and publishers are trying to find out who the Anonymous. Caregiver mentioned in the article is. They want to hear your story, learn your approach. Antonia blinked, trying to process the information. That's unexpected. It's more than that, Richard said, taking her hands again. It's the opportunity to transform your personal experience and what you did for our family into something that can help countless other grieving children and families. The magnitude of the possibility hit her like a wave. Suddenly, her work at the Maxwell Mansion no longer seemed to be coming to an end. It was transforming into something much bigger, something even she couldn't have imagined. I need to think, she finally said, overwhelmed by the possibilities. This would change everything. Richard nodded, understanding. Of course, but know that regardless of what you decide about these opportunities, what I was about to say before the phone call still stands. He hesitated, then continued with renewed determination. In fact, now more than ever, because this completely eliminates the issue of you working for me. Antonia felt her heart race again. And what were you about to say, Richard? He smiled, that rare and genuine smile she had learned to value. I was about to ask you to consider staying, not as our nanny, but as a permanent part of this family you helped rebuild. The words hung between them, full of promise and possibilities, as the morning sun illuminated the garden where soon new family memories would begin to blossom. The Los Angeles spring had reached its peak, transforming the Maxwell Mansion's garden into a spectacle of colors. Roses, hibiscus, and bougainvillea competed for space and attention, while the scent of jasmine filled the late afternoon air. Sitting on a wooden bench under the shade of a century-old tree, Antonia contemplated the transformation of the space that, 6 months earlier, she had found neglected and sad. Today, the garden reflected the same renewal that had occurred inside the house and within the hearts of its inhabitants. Richard's invitation, to stay as a permanent part of the family, had echoed in her mind for weeks, not because she doubted her feelings, but because she understood the magnitude of the decision for everyone involved. We need to give the boys time, she had told him that morning on the porch. They've been through too many changes in a short time. Richard agreed, demonstrating the new patience he had developed in recent months. We'll do it at their pace, he promised. I don't want to rush something so important. They had agreed to keep their relationship discreet initially, observing how the triplets would react to small changes. To their surprise, it was the children themselves who accelerated the process. During a dinner the following week, Michael had asked the question that hung in the air, with the characteristic frankness of his 6 years. When are you two going to stop pretending you don't like each other? Arthur had immediately supported his brother. Yeah, everyone already knows. Even Aunt Josephine commented to the gardener. Philip, with his silent observation, simply nodded, confirming the fraternal consensus. That moment had broken the last barrier. In the months that followed, Antonia and Richard built a relationship based not only on attraction, but on mutual admiration, and the partnership they had already established while caring for the boys. In parallel, Rebecca Carter's article continued to resonate. After careful consideration, Antonia decided to accept the invitation to share her experience, albeit on her own terms. She didn't want fame or excessive exposure, but she recognized the value of her approach for other families in similar situations. With the help of a small publisher specializing in child psychology, she began writing a book titled Hearts in Reconstruction, A Guide for Grieving Families. Richard, impressed with her vision, proposed using part of the resources from the Maxwell Foundation, newly created in Danielle's memory, to distribute the book free of charge in public schools and community centers. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the grass. Richard approached carrying 2 glasses of wine. "A penny for your thoughts," he said, sitting beside her and offering her a glass. Antonia smiled, accepting the drink. "I was thinking about how life turns. A year ago I was unemployed, desperate for an opportunity. Now," she gestured vaguely, as if words were insufficient to express the transformation. "Now you are a respected author, a sought-after family counselor, and—" Richard paused significantly, his eyes shining with something that looked like nervousness, a rare expression in the always confident businessman. "And I hope soon much more." Before Antonia could question the meaning of those words, they heard animated voices approaching. The triplets ran through the garden, followed by Josephine, who carried a tray with juices and snacks. "Are we late?" Michael asked, slightly out of breath. "Not at all, champ," Richard replied, checking his watch. "In fact, you're a few minutes early." Antonia watched with curiosity. Something clearly planned was happening, something she hadn't been a part of. "Can someone tell me what's going on?" she asked, looking from Richard to the boys. The three exchanged conspiratorial glances before Arthur responded. "It's a surprise. Daddy said we could help." "Help with what exactly?" Philip, who had been standing slightly behind his brothers, stepped forward, extending a small bouquet of wildflowers, clearly gathered from the garden. "They're for you," he said shyly. Moved by the gesture, Antonia accepted the flowers. "Thank you, Philip. They're beautiful." Michael cleared his throat with exaggeration, as if announcing something important. "We need to ask our questions first, remember, Daddy?" Richard nodded, visibly nervous now. "Of course, son. Go ahead." Michael formally positioned himself before Antonia, with the seriousness of a small ambassador. "Antonia, do you like living here with us?" The question caught her by surprise, but she answered sincerely, "I like it very much, more than any other place I've ever lived." Arthur stepped forward, taking his turn. "And do you like our dad?" "Like really, really like him." Antonia couldn't help but smile, feeling her face flush. "Yes, Arthur, I like your dad very much." Philip, always the most direct despite his shyness, asked the final question. "Do you want to be our mom?" The world seemed to freeze for an instant. Antonia felt her heart race as she processed the magnitude of those simple words. She looked at Richard, who was now standing, placing himself beside his children. "I didn't plan for it to be exactly like this," he explained with a nervous smile. "I thought I'd ask the question first, and then we'd talk to the boys, but—" He shrugged, as if recognizing the impossibility of completely controlling any situation involving 3 6-year-olds. To Antonia's astonishment, Richard knelt before her. From his pocket he took out a small blue velvet box. "Antonia Farrell," he began, his voice slightly trembling. "You came into our lives when we were lost in darkness. You didn't just care for the boys. You taught all of us how to live again, how to honor the past while embracing the future." He opened the box, revealing a delicate white gold ring with a single blue sapphire, the color of the boy's eyes, the color Antonia most associated with the family she had learned to love. "I know we are still building what we have, that there is still much to learn about each other. But I also know with a certainty I haven't felt in a long time that I want to spend the rest of my life on this journey of discovery with you, not as my gratitude for helping us, nor as my attempt to fill a void, but as two people who found something precious and unexpected in the midst of the storm." Antonia's eyes filled with tears as Richard continued. "So, with the enthusiastic support of my 3 little accomplices," he smiled at the boys, who watched the scene with wide-eyed anticipation, "I ask, Antonia Farrell, will you marry me? Not just to be my wife, but to continue this family you helped rebuild together." A silence charged with emotion hung in the garden. Even the birds seemed to have paused their singing to await the answer. Antonia looked at each of the 4 faces before her, the man who had learned to open his heart again, and the 3 boys who had captured her soul since their first chaotic encounter in the flooded bathroom. "Yes," she finally replied, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes to everything." The triplets exploded in celebration, jumping and shouting as if they had just won the most desired Christmas present. Josephine, who watched discreetly from the garden entrance, couldn't hold back her own tears. Richard slid the ring onto Antonia's finger and, momentarily ignoring the childish audience, leaned in for a kiss that sealed much more than an engagement. It sealed the promise of a reborn family. The wedding was held 3 months later, in the same garden where the proposal had taken place. The ceremony, though organized by one of Los Angeles's most prestigious event planners, maintained the intimacy that characterized the new Maxwell family. Only close friends, family, and a few people who had become important in their journey of recovery, like Rebecca Carter from Child Protective Services, were present. The triplets played the role of page boys with enthusiasm and seriousness, each carrying a small symbolic object to the altar. Michael carried the rings, Arthur, a small book representing the stories they would build together, and Philip, a framed drawing of the new family configuration, including a star in the sky that represented Danielle. When it was time for the vows, Richard spoke of new beginnings and gratitude, about how he had learned that the heart has an infinite capacity to love. Antonia, in turn, thanked life for the unexpected paths that had led her to that moment, and promised to honor both the past and the future of that family. To everyone's surprise, the boys had also prepared their own vows. "I promise to be a good son and always clean my room," Michael declared, with the seriousness of a state oath. "I promise to tell you stories when you're sad and remind Daddy to eat lunch when he gets distracted working," Arthur said, eliciting emotional laughter from the guests. Philip, the quietest, surprised everyone with his vow. "I promise to teach you how to make paper boats like you taught us on the first day. And I promise to always remember that our family is different, but special." There wasn't a dry eye in the garden when the ceremony ended. In the years that followed, the Maxwell mansion finally became a true home. The publication of Antonia's book generated a wave of support for grieving families, especially those with children. Richard, inspired by his wife's work, expanded the focus of the Maxwell Foundation to include emotional support programs in schools and underserved communities. 2 years after the wedding, the family grew with the arrival of Sophia, a girl with brown eyes like her mother's and a determined personality like her brother's. The triplets, now 8 years old, embraced their role as protectors with a touching seriousness. One quiet afternoon, while watching their 4 children playing in the garden, Richard found Antonia in her office, where she was reviewing the manuscript of her second book. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, noticing her contemplative gaze directed at the window. "How life can change in an instant," she replied, holding her husband's hand. "Sometimes for the worse, like when you lost Danielle. Other times for the better, like when I answered that job ad." Richard nodded, understanding perfectly. "Do you believe in destiny?" Antonia smiled, considering the question. "I believe that life presents us with possibilities, and it's up to us to have the courage to embrace them, even when they seem frightening or impossible." Through the window, they could see Sophia trying to keep up with her brothers in a race through the garden. Philip, always attentive, slowed his pace to hold her tiny hand, ensuring she didn't get left behind. "They're incredible," Richard commented, with evident pride in his voice. "Sometimes I wonder what they would have been like if—" He didn't complete the sentence, but it wasn't necessary. "It's not the events that define who we are, but how we respond to them," Antonia replied softly. "You 4 already had that light inside you. I just helped clear the path so it could shine again." Richard kissed her tenderly, in one of those moments that seemed to contain all the love and gratitude of the universe. That night, as they did on Danielle's birthday, the family gathered in the garden for a small ritual they had created together. They lit floating lanterns and released them into the small pond, sharing memories and feelings. "I think Mommy Danielle would be happy for us," Arthur commented, watching the lights reflected in the water. "I'm sure she would," Antonia agreed, hugging the boy. "True love is never exclusive or possessive. It always wants the best for those it loves, even when it can no longer be physically present." Michael, now with the maturity of his 8 years, asked, "Is it possible to love 2 mums?" "Not just possible, but a great privilege," Antonia replied. "Some children have hearts big enough for that." Sophia, still too young to fully understand the meaning of that moment, raised her arms to the starry sky. "Hello, Star Mummy," she said in her childish voice, pointing to the brightest one in the firmament. Philip, who rarely spoke about his deepest feelings, surprised everyone with his observation. "Our family is like a puzzle that lost some pieces, but found different ones that fit anyway." Richard hugged his son, deeply touched by his wisdom. "That's exactly it, Philip. Her unique and perfect puzzle in its own way." As the lanterns floated gently across the pond, illuminating the night with their soft glow, Antonia contemplated the path that had brought her there. From an orphaned girl folding paper boats in foster homes to an accomplished woman, surrounded by a family she had helped rebuild. Life didn't always offer perfect happy endings, like in the stories she told her children before bed. In real life, happiness was mingled with scars, bittersweet memories, and constant challenges. But it was precisely this complexity that made every moment of joy so precious. Watching Richard and the children illuminated by the soft glow of the lanterns, Antonia felt a deep certainty. She hadn't come to that family just to heal others' wounds. She had found finally the place where her own broken heart could be completely rebuilt. We are all paper boats sailing in waters sometimes calm, sometimes turbulent, she thought, recalling the metaphor she had used on her first day in that house. The important thing is not how resilient our vessel seems, but who we choose to sail alongside us. And there, under the starry Los Angeles sky, surrounded by those 4 hearts that had become her compass and her haven, Antonia knew she had finally found her safe harbor. Dear listeners, we hope Antonia and the Maxwell story has touched your hearts. To continue this emotional journey, we have prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories. Find it here by clicking on the left. If you enjoyed this narrative of rebuilding and love, be sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of life and the human capacity for overcoming challenges. Share in the comments if you have experienced or witnessed a story of new beginnings like this. We look forward to reading your accounts and connecting hearts through these experiences.